The last thing I saw was his smile. Not the charming, camera-ready smile the world knew, but a different one. A thin, tight slash across his face, devoid of warmth, full of grim satisfaction. It was the smile of a man closing a deal, not a husband looking at his wife of 15 years. Then his hands, the same hands that had held mine at the altar, shoved hard against the small of my back. For a fraction of a second, my boots scraped against the icy lip of the precipice, a desperate, useless fight for purchase. And then, there was only air. Cold, thin, mountain air that stole my breath as I plunged into the chasm. Chloe, my baby sister, stood beside him. She didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She simply watched, her expression as placid as a frozen lake, as if I were nothing more than a stone she'd skipped across the water. That was the image burned into my mind as the world became a blur of white snow and black rock, before it became nothing at all. They think I'm dead. They're probably holding my memorial service right now. Mark playing the part of the grieving widower to perfection. But before I tell you how I clawed my way out of that frozen grave and walked back into their lives like a ghost summoned by vengeance, you need to understand the weeks leading up to that day. You need to understand the man I thought I knew, the sister I thought I loved, and the beautiful, terrible secret buried deep in the earth that they were willing to kill for. Before we go on, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you feel a connection to this story. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I want you to know that hearing from you, knowing I'm not alone in this, means more than you can imagine. My name is Elena Hayes. I'm a geologist, I'm 46 years old, and for 14 days, the world believed I was dead. This is the story of how they were wrong. It all started 6 weeks before the fall, in a sterile lawyer's office in downtown Denver that smelled of old paper and ambition. My grandfather, Thomas, had passed away. He was 93, a tough old rockhound who'd lived a life as rugged as the mountains he loved. I was his only grandchild who'd inherited his passion for the earth's secrets. While Chloe was drawn to fashion and Mark to the stock market, I was the one who'd spent summers with Grandpa, learning to read the stories written in layers of sediment and stone. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Abernathy, with eyes that seemed to appraise my worth with every blink, cleared his throat. "Elena," he said, his voice a dry rustle, "your grandfather has left the entirety of his estate to you." Mark, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand. I felt a tremor of excitement from him, but my own heart was heavy with grief. The estate wasn't just a number on a page. It was Grandpa's legacy. It was his home, his memories, and the land. 1,000 acres of raw, untamed wilderness in the San Juan Mountains. The land, Abernathy continued, sliding a thick portfolio across the polished mahogany table, is the most significant part of the inheritance. Thomas conducted extensive surveys over the years. It appears the land sits on one of the richest deposits of tellurium in North America. I drew in a sharp breath. Tellurium. A rare, silvery white metalloid, critical for the next generation of solar panels and thermoelectric technology. It was a geologist's dream. Not for the money, but for the discovery. The sheer scientific significance. Mark's grip on my hand tightened, this time painfully. How much is that worth?" he asked, leaning forward, his voice a low, hungry whisper. Mr. Abernathy adjusted his glasses. "With current market prices and the estimated yield, conservatively, we're looking at a valuation north of $50 million. The number hung in the air, thick and heavy. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. I was thinking of the delicate crystalline structures of the element, of the research potential, of building a sustainable, ethical mining operation that would honor Grandpa's love for the land. But when I looked at my husband, I saw something else in his eyes. It wasn't wonder. It wasn't excitement for me or for science. It was pure, unadulterated greed. It was the look of a predator who had just spotted its prey. And for the first time, I had the sickening feeling that the prey was me. The drive home was quiet, but it was a loud kind of quiet. The kind where the unspoken things scream at you from the passenger seat. Mark kept tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, a frantic, rhythmic beat that matched the sudden racing tempo of his ambition. I stared out the window at the familiar Denver skyline, but it felt alien, as if I was seeing it through a distorted lens. The $50 million figure was an intruder in our marriage, a silent third person sitting in the back seat. "50 million, Elle," he finally said, breaking the silence. He used my nickname, the one he always used when he wanted something. "Can you believe it? This is it. This is everything we've ever worked for." We? I thought. I had worked for my PhD in geology. I had worked for the respect of my peers, spending months at a time on remote research expeditions. He had worked as a mid-level investment broker, always chasing a bigger bonus, always complaining about the clients, the market, the unfairness of it all. This wasn't something we had worked for. This was a gift from my grandfather, a legacy entrusted to me. "It's not just about the money, Mark," I said softly. "It's the land, the science. Grandpa Thomas wanted it protected. He wanted it studied, not just strip-mined for a quick payout." He shot me a look, a flash of irritation that he quickly masked with a patient smile. It was a look I'd been seeing more and more often. "Of course, honey, of course. We'll be smart about it. We'll set up a foundation, a scholarship in his name. We can do all of that. But you have to be practical. This kind of money, it changes the game. No more mortgages, no more worrying about retirement. We could travel the world, first class." His words painted a picture I didn't recognize. My dreams weren't about first-class flights. They were about first-hand discoveries. They were about the smell of pine after a rainstorm on that land, the feel of a rare mineral sample in my hand. That evening, Chloe came over. She'd heard the news. She swept into our home, all Chanel perfume and feigned excitement, hugging me tightly. "Ellie, I am so happy for you. You deserve this more than anyone." Her voice was bright, but her eyes, when they darted over my shoulder to meet Mark's, held a different light. A shared, secret gleam. They stood in the kitchen while I was in the living room, supposedly looking for a photo of Grandpa. I could hear their hushed tones, the low murmur of their voices. I caught snippets. "Can't believe the old man. Has to be handled delicately. She's too sentimental." When I walked back in, they fell silent, smiling at me with an unnerving synchronicity. "We were just saying," Chloe said, her voice smooth as silk, "how we need to celebrate, properly." Mark nodded in agreement. "I was thinking the same thing. Our 15th anniversary is next month. What if we did something special? Just the three of us. We could hike a section of the new property, a toast to Grandpa and to our future." It sounded perfect, too perfect. A hike, something I loved, a tribute to my grandfather, a celebration of our marriage. It was a beautifully wrapped package designed to appeal to every one of my emotional touchstones. Yet, a small, cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. Why the three of us? Anniversaries were for two. "Chloe too?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Mark put his arm around me, pulling me close. His touch felt proprietary, not affectionate. "Of course, she's your sister. This is a family celebration. She can help us document everything, take pictures. It'll be a memory we'll cherish forever." He looked at Chloe and she smiled back. It was a closed circuit of understanding, and I was on the outside. Against my better judgment, against the screaming instinct in my gut, I agreed. Because I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe my husband loved me, that my sister was happy for me, that the cold knot in my stomach was just paranoia. It was a fatal mistake. Choosing to believe in the beautiful lie they were selling me instead of the ugly truth I could feel in my bones. The weeks leading up to the anniversary hike were a masterclass in manipulation. Mark transformed into the man I had first fallen in love with, attentive, charming, and endlessly supportive. He'd bring me coffee in the morning, asking about my preliminary plans for the land. He'd listen with a feigned intensity as I talked about soil composition and environmental impact studies, nodding and saying things like, "That's brilliant, Elle. Truly, you see things no one else does." He was validating my passion, but now I see he was only scouting the terrain of my mind, looking for weaknesses. Chloe was his shadow, his amplifier. She'd call me daily. "Mark is just so excited, Ellie. He told me he's planning a huge surprise for you on the trip. He's been a different person since the news. It's like he's finally seeing a future without limits." She was painting a narrative, a beautiful story of a husband re-inspired by his wife's good fortune. They were building a cage of comfort and false security around me. And I, fool that I was, walked right in. They meticulously planned the trip. The location was a remote peak on the northern edge of the property, called Widow's Peak. The name should have been a warning. It was known for its dramatic cliffs and sudden violent weather changes. Mark sold it as an adventure. "It's the most stunning view on the entire property, Elle. Grandpa's journals talk about it. He said it's where you can feel the soul of the mountain." He was using my grandfather's words against me, twisting my love for him into a lure. I spent my time buried in geological maps and survey reports, my excitement for the land eclipsing my suspicions. I identified a specific outcrop near the summit of Widow's Peak that Grandpa's notes had flagged as having an unusually high concentration of quartz veins, often an indicator for tellurium. I told Mark I wanted to take samples there. "Perfect," he'd said, his eyes lighting up in a way that I mistook for shared enthusiasm. "We'll make that the highlight of our hike." The night before we left, I was packing my gear. My rock hammer, sample bags, GPS locator, a specialized altimeter. Mark watched me from the doorway of our bedroom. "You and your rocks," he said, shaking his head with a fond smile. "Don't forget to pack something warm. The forecast says a cold front is moving in." It was such a normal, caring thing to say. But he wasn't just talking about the weather. He came over and held my hands. "I want you to know," he said, his voice low and sincere, "that I am so incredibly proud of you. And I promise, this anniversary is going to be the start of a new chapter for us, the best one yet." He kissed me, a long, tender kiss that felt like a final performance. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs for a glass of water and heard voices from the back patio. Mark and Chloe. I crept to the window, my heart pounding. I couldn't see them, but I could hear their words drifting through the slightly ajar door. "Everything is in place?" Chloe's voice was a nervous hiss. "Don't worry." Mark's voice was smooth, confident. "It'll look like a tragic accident. No one will question a thing. She's so trusting, she'll walk right to the edge for a piece of worthless rock." A piece of worthless rock. My life's passion, dismissed with such casual cruelty. My blood ran cold. This was it, the confirmation, the ugly, undeniable truth. I should have screamed. I should have called the police. I should have run. But I was paralyzed, frozen by a grief so profound, it felt like a physical blow. The betrayal wasn't just about money. They were trying to erase me, to reduce my entire existence to a stepping stone for their greed. I stood there in the dark, clutching my stomach, and a terrible, cold resolve settled over me. I would still go on that hike, but I wouldn't be their victim. I had to know. I had to see it in their eyes. I had to look my husband and my sister in the face as they tried to murder me. The morning of the hike, the air in our home was thick with unspoken words. I moved through the motions like an actor in a play, my voice and movements detached from the storm raging inside me. I made coffee. I checked my pack. I smiled at Mark when he kissed my cheek, a gesture so grotesquely normal it made me want to retch. Every nerve in my body was screaming, but I forced a mask of calm onto my face. If I was going to confront this, I needed to be clear-headed, not hysterical. My only true ally, Kodiak, my 7-year-old Siberian Husky, seemed to sense the tension. He whined softly, pressing his massive, furry body against my legs, his piercing blue eyes fixed on my face as if asking what was wrong. I buried my face in his thick ruff, breathing in his familiar, comforting scent. "It's okay, boy," I whispered, my voice thick. "You're coming with me. You'll keep me safe." Chloe arrived, her cheerfulness a grating performance. She hugged me. The scent of her expensive perfume, an assault on my senses. "Ready for the big adventure?" she chirped. The drive to the mountains was surreal. They chatted in the front seat, their voices a meaningless buzz in my ears. They talked about the future, about a trip to Monaco, about buying a yacht. They were spending my money, celebrating my death before I was even gone. I sat in the back with Kodiak, one hand tangled in his fur, the other clenching and unclenching in my lap. I watched Mark's eyes in the rearview mirror. They were empty, devoid of conflict, of remorse. He was a stranger. We arrived at the trailhead. The air was crisp and cold, the sky a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The snow-dusted peaks of the San Juans loomed over us, majestic and indifferent. "Okay," Mark said, clapping his hands together. "Here's the plan. It's a steep climb. To make better time, I think we should leave Kodiak here, at the base. We can tie him up near the stream. He'll have water, and we'll be back in a few hours." My blood turned to ice. "No," I said, my voice sharp. It was the first time I'd pushed back. "He comes with me." Mark's smile tightened. "Elle, be reasonable. It's a treacherous path. He could slip, or cause one of us to slip. It's safer for everyone if he stays here." Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with false concern. "Mark's right, Ellie. We wouldn't want anything to happen to your sweet boy." They were isolating me, removing my protector. It was a calculated move, and it terrified me more than anything. I looked at Kodiak, at his steady, loyal gaze. I wouldn't leave him, but I was trapped. If I refused, it would raise suspicion. They might call the whole thing off, only to try again later, in a place and time I couldn't anticipate. Reluctantly, my heart tearing in two, I agreed. I knelt down and hugged Kodiak, burying my face in his fur one last time. "I'll be back, boy, I promise." I secured his leash to a thick alder tree near the gurgling creek. He whined, a deep, mournful sound that echoed the grief in my own soul, as he watched us walk away. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see the betrayal in his eyes, too. He was the only one in my world who was innocent, and I was leaving him behind. Every step I took up that mountain trail felt like a step toward my own execution. The weight in my pack felt impossibly heavy, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the knowledge I carried. The beautiful scenery passed in a blur. All I could see were their faces, their easy smiles, their calculated lies. And all I could hear was the echo of Kodiak's lonely howl. The climb was grueling. The path grew steeper, narrowing to a slick, icy ledge in places. The thin air burned my lungs. Mark led the way, setting a punishing pace, while Chloe followed, complaining about the cold and her expensive hiking boots. It was all part of the act. The concerned husband pushing them toward a beautiful destination, the slightly spoiled sister along for the ride. They were building their alibi with every step, I was silent, conserving my energy, my mind a whirlwind of strategy and fear. I thought about confronting them right there on the trail, but the path was too narrow, the advantage theirs. I needed to choose my ground, or rather, let them lead me to the ground they had chosen. After 2 hours of relentless climbing, we reached a plateau just below the summit. The view was breathtaking, a panorama of jagged peaks and deep, shadow-filled valleys. And there, at the edge of the plateau, was the outcrop I had told them about. A sheer wall of rock, glittering with quartz, dropping away into a deep, narrow fissure. Widow's Peak. The stage was set. "Here we are, Elle," Mark said, his voice slightly breathless. He gestured to the cliff edge. "Just like you wanted. Your special rocks." He was practically giddy, the excitement of a predator closing in on its prey. Chloe pulled out her phone. "Oh, Ellie, you have to get a picture. Stand right by the edge. The lighting is perfect." They were directing me, positioning me for the final scene. I walked slowly towards the precipice, my heart hammering against my ribs. The wind whipped at my hair, a mournful wailing sound. I knelt down, feigning interest in a vein of feldspar, my gloved hand brushing against the cold, solid rock. This was my last connection to a world that made sense, a world governed by pressure and time, not by greed and betrayal. I ran through my options. A fight was useless. They were 2 against 1. My only hope was to anticipate the move, to try and control the fall, to somehow survive what was meant to be unsurvivable. I stalled for time. "I need my hammer. It's in my pack," I said, not looking at them. "Could you get it for me, Mark?" "Of course, honey," he said. I heard the rustle of him opening my backpack, but he wasn't getting the hammer. I knew what he was getting. He was removing the contents. My GPS, my food, my emergency supplies. He was stripping me of any chance of survival, ensuring the mountain would finish the job he was about to start. I braced myself, planting my feet as firmly as I could on the icy ground. "You know," I said, my voice eerily calm, my back still to them. "Grandpa always said this mountain demands respect. He said it has a long memory. It remembers everything that happens on its slopes." There was a moment of silence. I think my tone surprised them. It wasn't the voice of an oblivious victim. "What are you talking about, Elena?" Chloe's voice was sharp, a flicker of unease in it. I stood up slowly and turned to face them. I looked Mark directly in the eye. "I'm talking about betrayal, Mark. About lies." His face changed. The mask of the loving husband dissolved, replaced by a cold, hard fury. The pretense was over. "You should have just been grateful," he hissed, taking a step towards me. "You should have just signed the papers." And then he lunged. It wasn't a shove. It was a violent, committed push with his entire body weight behind it. My last conscious thought wasn't one of fear or anger, but of a profound, bottomless sorrow. And the final, cruel irony. He did it on the very spot that held the geological treasure I had so desperately wanted to share with him. The fall was a chaotic symphony of sensation. The sickening weightlessness, the violent tumble through the air, the brutal impacts against the jagged rock walls of the crevasse. My body was a rag doll, thrown away by a careless child. I remember a sharp, cracking sound, an explosion of white-hot pain in my left leg that seemed to obliterate all other thought. Then a final, jarring slam as I hit the bottom. And then, mercifully, blackness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Minutes? Hours? When I came to, it was to a world of muted gray light and agonizing pain. I was wedged at the bottom of the fissure, which was no more than 5 feet wide. Above me, a narrow slit of sky seemed miles away. Snow had drifted down, partially covering me, a premature burial shroud. Every inch of my body screamed in protest. My head throbbed, my ribs felt bruised and broken, but it was my leg that was the epicenter of my agony. I looked down and saw it bent at an unnatural angle just below the knee. A compound fracture. Bone had pierced the fabric of my thermal pants. The sight of it, so alien and wrong, sent a wave of nausea through me. The cold was a living entity. It was a physical presence, seeping through my expensive winter gear, sinking its teeth into my bones. The temperature at the top had been around 0 degrees Celsius, but down here, in the permanent shadow of the crevasse, it felt like a deep freezer. I guessed it was at least -15. Hypothermia was not a risk. It was a certainty. It was their backup plan. The fall was meant to kill me. If it didn't, the cold would. But the physical pain, as excruciating as it was nothing compared to the storm in my mind. The betrayal replayed itself in a torturous loop. Mark's face, contorted with a hate I never knew he possessed. Chloe's cold, passive observation. My sister. The little girl whose hair I used to braid, whose scraped knees I used to bandage. How does a person become that? How does love curdle into something so monstrous? They had stood up there, looked down at where I had fallen, and then simply walked away. They had left me to die in a frozen tomb, their footsteps on the snow above the last sounds I would ever hear. Tears froze on my cheeks. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over me. What was the point of fighting? My leg was shattered. I had no food, no water, no way to call for help. My own husband and sister wanted me dead. Maybe it was better this way. Just to close my eyes, to let the cold take me, to let the numbness creep in and silence the pain, both in my body and in my heart. I was so tired. The will to live, the fiery spirit that had driven me to scale mountains and explore the world's wildest places, had been extinguished. I was just a broken body at the bottom of a hole in the ground. I closed my eyes, ready for the end. I thought of my grandfather. I thought of Kodiak. And then I let go, drifting into a gray, featureless void where nothing could hurt me anymore. The silence of the mountain was absolute, waiting to claim me. Just as consciousness began to fray at the edges, a sound pierced the heavy silence. A faint, desperate whine from high above. I thought I was hallucinating, my freezing brain conjuring ghosts to comfort me in my final moments. But then it came again, louder this time. A frantic bark echoing off the narrow rock walls. My eyes fluttered open. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But the sound was real, a thread of life pulling me back from the brink. Then I saw him. A flash of black and white fur against the stark gray sky. Kodiak. He was at the edge of the crevasse, his paws digging at the snow, his whole body trembling with agitation. He had broken free. My heart, which had all but given up, gave a painful lurch. He let out another soul-wrenching howl. He had found me. The rope I had tied him with must have been frayed, or he had, with the sheer power of his desperation, chewed right through it. He had followed our scent up the mountain, a trail of betrayal he could not understand, driven by a loyalty I had not deserved in that moment I left him. He paced the edge, whining, his distress a palpable thing. I tried to call out to him, but my voice was a dry, broken croak. "Kodiak, I'm here, boy." He stopped, his head cocked, his ears swiveling to pinpoint the sound. He saw me. He let out a series of sharp, excited barks, his tail giving a frantic thump, thump, thump against the snow. And then, he did something that defied all logic and instinct. He launched himself into the abyss. It wasn't a fall, it was a controlled slide. He used his powerful legs and claws to brace against the steep, snowy incline of the fissure wall, descending in a shower of snow and dislodged pebbles. He landed at the bottom with a soft thud, miraculously unharmed. He was immediately at my side, licking my face, nudging my still body with his wet nose, whining with a mixture of relief and concern. The warmth of his body against my frozen cheek was the most profound sensation I had ever felt. It was life. It was hope. And then I saw it. Still clipped to his thick collar, bouncing against his chest, was the small, waterproof pouch I always kept his essentials in for long hikes. I had put it on him that morning out of habit. My hands, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the clasp. Inside were a few high-energy dog treats, a roll of gauze, a small tube of antiseptic ointment, and a fire starter. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was a lifeline. Mark and Chloe had taken my pack, but they had forgotten about the dog. They had underestimated his loyalty, his intelligence, and his bond with me. In their cruel, meticulous planning, Kodiak was the one variable they hadn't properly accounted for. He was the flaw in their perfect crime. Tears streamed down my face again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of a fierce, desperate gratitude. I hugged his massive, furry neck, burying my face in his thick coat. He had come for me. He had risked his own life to be by my side. In the face of the worst of human nature, I was confronted with the very best of animal devotion. I looked into his intelligent blue eyes, and I saw a reflection of my own will to live, a will I thought had been extinguished. For him, I had to fight. For him, I had to survive. For him, I had to climb out of this hellhole and rain down a justice so absolute upon my betrayers that the mountain itself would remember their names. The fire wasn't out. It had just been waiting for a spark. And that spark was a 7-year-old husky who loved me more than life itself. The first 24 hours were a brutal, methodical battle against shock and the encroaching cold. With Kodiak's arrival, the fog of despair had lifted, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged clarity. Survival was no longer a vague hope. It was a series of problems to be solved. And my mind, the geologist's mind trained to analyze, assess, and act, took over. First, the leg. The pain was a constant roaring fire. I knew if I didn't stabilize it, infection or shock would kill me long before the cold did. I looked around the bottom of the crevasse. It was littered with debris that had fallen from above over the years, rocks, dirt, and a few gnarled, dead branches. They were my salvation. I found 2 branches that were relatively straight and thick. Using a sharp-edged piece of granite, I painstakingly sawed them to the right length, one for each side of my lower leg. Setting the bone was the purest form of agony I have ever known. I gave Kodiak one of his treats to keep him occupied, took a deep breath, and with a guttural scream that echoed up the chasm walls, I pulled. I aligned the shattered bones as best I could, my vision going white with pain. I nearly passed out, but the image of Mark's smiling face kept me conscious, fueled by a white-hot rage. I then positioned the branches as splints. The roll of gauze from Kodiak's pouch was my only binding material. It wasn't enough to secure the splints tightly, but it was a start. I tore strips from the hem of my insulated jacket, my teeth chattering uncontrollably, and used them to lash the branches to my leg until it was rigid and immobile. It was a crude, ugly fix, but it was a fix. Next, water. Dehydration was as great a threat as the cold. The crevasse was full of snow and ice, but eating it directly was a death sentence. It would lower my core body temperature at a catastrophic rate. I needed a way to melt it. My eyes scanned my prison again. In a small alcove in the rock wall, I found a piece of rusted metal, probably part of some old mining equipment from a century ago, shaped like a shallow bowl. It was a gift from the mountain. I cleared a small area of snow down to the bare rock. Then I took out the fire starter from Kodiak's pouch. It was a simple magnesium stick with a striker. My hands were so numb I could barely hold it. I shredded the gauze packaging and a small piece of my inner glove lining for tinder. I struck the flint again and again, my clumsy fingers failing to create a spark. Panic began to set in. This was it. If I couldn't make fire, I was dead. I tucked my hands into my armpits, forcing the blood back into them, blowing on them until I could feel a faint tingling. I took a deep, calming breath, picturing my grandfather showing me how to do this as a child on one of our camping trips. Patience, Elena. Let the tool do the work. I tried again. A spark. Another. And then a tiny flame licked at the tinder. I cupped my hands around it, gently feeding it tiny splinters of dry wood I broke off the branches, until a small, precious fire was dancing in the darkness. I had never seen a more beautiful sight. I carefully placed snow into the rusted metal bowl and set it near the flames. As the first drops of water began to form, I wept. It was more than water. It was life. It was defiance. I huddled close to the small fire, Kodiak pressed against my back, his body a living furnace. I had survived the first day. They had left me for dead, but I was a geologist. I knew how to read the earth, how to find its hidden resources, and deep in this frozen fissure, I was rediscovering my own. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival, each one a small victory against the relentless assault of the mountain. My world shrank to the 5-foot width of the crevasse and the single-minded focus of staying alive. Time was measured not in hours, but in tasks. Stoke the fire, melt more snow, check the splint, ration the dog treats. I broke the 3 treats from Kodiak's pouch into tiny pieces. I would eat one small piece each day, just enough to keep the worst of the hunger pangs at bay. The rest was for him. He was burning more calories than I was, and his strength was my strength. He was my early warning system, his sharp ears picking up the sound of a distant rockfall long before I did. He was my furnace, his thick fur and 90-pound body the only reason I survived the nights, when the temperature plunged into a deep, deadly cold, and my small fire dwindled to embers. We would huddle together, a 2-species pack against the world, and I would listen to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my back. My scientific knowledge, once an academic pursuit, became my most vital tool. I understood the principles of thermodynamics, which helped me build a small rock wall around my fire to reflect the heat back at us. I knew about the caloric content of lichen, and I spent hours scraping a meager, bitter-tasting supply from the rocks, supplementing our starvation diet. I used my knowledge of geology to find the most stable part of the crevasse, away from the danger of falling ice and rock. But the mental battle was far more difficult than the physical one. The silence was a crushing weight, broken only by the whisper of the wind far above and the crackle of my fire. In that silence, the demons came. The memory of the betrayal would ambush me, a fresh wave of grief and rage. I would see Mark's face, Chloe's empty eyes, and I would be consumed by a helpless fury. I would talk to Kodiak for hours, my voice raw, telling him everything. About my childhood with Chloe, about falling in love with Mark, about my dreams for the land. He would listen, his head resting on my lap, his blue eyes watching me with an unnerving intelligence. He kept me sane. His presence was a constant grounding reality in a world that had become a nightmare. He was a living, breathing reason to keep fighting. When despair threatened to pull me under, I would look at him, and he would nudge my hand with his nose or lick my face, a simple, profound reminder that I was not alone. Around the 5th day, a blizzard hit. Snow swirled down into the crevasse, threatening to extinguish my fire and bury us completely. The wind howled like a banshee. I huddled in the small alcove, shielding the flames with my own body, piling rocks to create a better windbreak. Kodiak lay over my injured leg, his body a shield against the biting wind and snow. For 2 days the storm raged, We couldn't move. We could only endure. In those dark, frozen hours, I made a promise to myself. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. They had used my love of this mountain to try and kill me. I would use my knowledge of it to save myself. They thought I was a sentimental fool, a woman who cared more for rocks than for profit. They were about to find out what happens when you push a rock too far. It doesn't just break, it starts an avalanche. By the 10th day, my body was failing. The starvation, the relentless cold, and the constant pain were taking their toll. My thoughts grew sluggish, and I would drift into moments of delirium, mistaking the patterns in the rock face for human figures. The infection in my leg was a dull, persistent throb, a ticking clock. I knew I was running out of time. The meager supply of lichen and the last crumb of dog treat were gone. We were starving. That morning, I was cleaning the wound as best I could with melted snow when Kodiak suddenly stood up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His ears were erect, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on a spot high up the crevasse wall. I followed his gaze and saw it. A mountain goat perched precariously on a tiny ledge about 30 feet up. It must have slipped and become trapped. It was a mature male, its horns thick, its coat a dirty white against the gray rock. And it was my only chance. A desperate, primal plan formed in my mind. I was a scientist, not a hunter. But I was also a predator now, cornered and fighting for my life. I found the sharpest, most pointed rock I could, its edge honed by millennia of friction. I whispered to Kodiak, "Stay, boy. Be quiet." He seemed to understand, sinking back down but never taking his eyes off the goat. I began to climb. The pain in my leg was blinding, but I ignored it. I used only my arms and my good leg, finding handholds and footholds in the rock face that I had studied for days. Every upward movement was a symphony of agony. My muscles screamed, my head spun from exertion and hunger. The goat watched me, its black eyes wary. It was trapped, with nowhere to go. When I was finally within 10 feet of it, I stopped, clinging to the rock face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I threw the rock with all the strength I had left. It was a clumsy, desperate throw, but it struck the goat on the side of its head. It staggered, lost its footing, and with a bleat of alarm, it tumbled down into the crevasse, landing with a heavy thud near my fire. Kodiak was on it in an instant. The next few hours were a grim, bloody business. Using my sharp rock, I did what I had to do. I gave the best parts to Kodiak, and for the first time in over a week, we ate. The raw meat was difficult to stomach, but it was fuel. It was life. The protein and fat coursed through my system, clearing the fog from my brain, infusing me with a strength I thought I had lost forever. We feasted, and then we rested, a primal satisfaction settling over us. The goat provided more than just meat. Its hide, once scraped clean, gave me a source of thick, warm insulation to wrap around myself at night. Its bones could be sharpened into tools. Its sinew could be used as cordage. It was a gift from the mountain, a reward for my tenacity. As I sat by the fire that night, gnawing on a piece of cooked meat, a profound shift occurred within me. I was no longer just Elena Hayes, the geologist, the victim. I had been stripped down to my most essential self. I had faced death and chosen life. I had hunted and killed to survive. I had become as wild and as unforgiving as the landscape around me. Mark and Chloe had tried to bury me in the wilderness, but they had made a grave miscalculation. They didn't realize the wilderness was my home. And I was finally ready to climb out of my grave and start the long walk back. The first stage of my survival was over. The hunt was about to begin. The day after the goat was the beginning of the end of my time in the fissure. My purpose had crystallized into a single burning objective: get out. Not just survive, but ascend. I spent the entire day in preparation, my mind working with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Every action was deliberate, a step in a complex engineering problem. First, I created a new tool. I took the goat's femur, a long, thick bone, and spent hours grinding one end against a piece of coarse granite until it formed a wicked, sharp point. It was a primitive ice axe, a digger, a weapon. It felt heavy and substantial in my hand, a symbol of my own transformation. I was no longer just a victim of the mountain. I was now equipped with its own savage tools. Next, the rope. The goat's hide, while warm, was too valuable as a whole to be cut up. But the sinew and intestines, once cleaned and braided, were another matter. I painstakingly teased apart the long, fibrous tendons from the goat's legs. My fingers, still stiff and clumsy from the cold, fumbled with the slick material. I braided them together, 3 strands at a time, then braided those braids together, creating a crude but incredibly strong cord about 20 feet long. It wasn't a climbing rope, not by any professional standard, but it would be a lifeline. The most critical task was preparing myself for the climb. My splinted leg was an anchor of agony. I knew I couldn't put any direct weight on it. The ascent would have to be accomplished almost entirely with my upper body and my one good leg. I spent hours simply moving, testing my limits. I would do pull-ups on a sturdy rock ledge, my muscles screaming, my vision swimming. I would practice leveraging my body, using the walls of the crevasse to brace myself. Each movement was a negotiation with pain, and with each successful maneuver, I gained a sliver of confidence. Kodiak watched me, a silent, attentive observer. He seemed to understand what I was doing. When I would collapse in exhaustion, he would be there, nudging my face, a low whine of encouragement in his throat. I saved the last, best piece of the goat's heart for him. "This is for the climb, boy," I told him, stroking his head. "You wait for me at the bottom. You be my anchor. When I get to the top, I'll find a way to get you out. I promise." The morning I chose to begin my ascent was cold and clear. The sliver of sky above was a sharp, brilliant blue. I secured my new bone axe to a loop on my belt. I coiled the sinew rope and slung it over my shoulder. I ate a final meal of roasted meat, the fat giving me a much-needed surge of energy. I stood at the base of the most promising section of the rock wall, a jagged, fractured surface that offered a series of small but viable handholds. I looked up. It was a vertical wall of about 70 feet. It might as well have been a mile. I took a deep breath, the icy air searing my lungs. I looked down at Kodiak. "Watch me, boy." His blue eyes were locked on mine. I placed my hands on the rock. The cold was a shock, even through my tattered gloves. I found a foothold for my good leg and pulled myself up. The pain in my fractured leg was immediate and blinding, a white-hot scream that shot up my entire body. I cried out, my forehead pressed against the frozen rock. For a moment, I thought I couldn't do it. The sheer, overwhelming agony was too much. But then I heard a sharp bark from below. I looked down. Kodiak was standing on his hind legs, his front paws against the wall, looking up at me. He barked again, a sound of pure, urgent command. He was not giving me permission to fail. I gritted my teeth, the rage at my betrayers flooding back, a welcome antidote to the pain. I found my next handhold, and I pulled myself up again, 1 foot at a time. The hunt had begun. While I was fighting for my first few feet of freedom, Mark and Chloe were 500 miles away in Denver, perfecting their performance of grief. The official search for my body had been called off 2 days earlier, on the 7th day of my disappearance. The blizzard had been their greatest ally, blanketing the mountains in a thick, impenetrable layer of snow, erasing all tracks, all hope. The search and rescue team had made the announcement with grim faces, offering their condolences to the devastated husband. Mark had played his part flawlessly. He had stood before the television cameras, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, a trick he'd learned using a sliver of onion kept in his handkerchief, his voice breaking as he thanked the brave volunteers. "My wife, Elena, she loved those mountains," he'd said. his voice choking with manufactured emotion. She died doing what she loved. I find some small comfort in that. She is one with the wilderness she dedicated her life to understanding. It was a beautiful, poetic lie, and the media consumed it voraciously. He became a tragic, sympathetic figure overnight. The handsome, heartbroken husband, robbed of his brilliant wife by the cruel hand of fate. That night, after the cameras were gone, their true selves emerged. Chloe had a bottle of Cristal champagne on ice. "To us," she said, raising her glass, a triumphant smirk on her face. They were in my home, my beautiful craftsman house that I had lovingly restored. They had already begun to erase me, replacing my photos with bland, impersonal art prints. Mark took a long, deep drink of the champagne, his eyes gleaming. "It's over," he breathed, a sigh of profound relief. The SAR team officially declared her presumed deceased, Abernathy called. "With that declaration, we can get an expedited death certificate. The clock starts now." Chloe ran her hand down his arm, her nails tracing patterns on his expensive watch. "And the corporation? Are they still in?" "They're chomping at the bit," Mark said, a smug grin spreading across his face. "They sent a preliminary offer this morning. $62 million. The tellurium estimates were even richer than the old man thought." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "They're talking about the Elena Hayes Memorial Conservation Fund as part of the deal. A 7-figure donation to a charity of my choice. The PR is perfect." They clinked their glasses together. There was no remorse, no guilt, no flicker of humanity. Only the cold, hard calculus of their greed. My memory wasn't a source of grief. It was a public relations strategy. My legacy wasn't in my scientific work. It was a tax-deductible donation. They thought they had won. They were standing on my grave, drinking champagne and dividing the spoils. They had no idea that the ghost they were toasting was, at that very moment, clinging to a rock face, fueled by a hatred so pure it had become a force of nature. They were celebrating the end of the story, completely unaware that I was about to write a whole new, bloody chapter. The climb was a vertical battle, a slow, torturous crawl between two worlds. My prison below and the free, open air above. Every inch was purchased with a currency of pain and sheer, bloody-minded will. The bone axe was my third hand, my anchor. I would wedge it into a crack in the rock above me, test it with my full weight, and then haul myself up, my arms and shoulders burning with a fire that rivaled the agony in my leg. My fingers, raw and bleeding inside my gloves, became claws, seeking purchase on the smallest of ledges, the slightest of protrusions. I learned to read the rock face not just as a geologist, but as a survivor. I could see the subtle changes in texture that signaled a stronger hold. I recognized the treacherous, crumbling shale and avoided it, favoring the solid, reliable granite. My grandfather's lessons, once academic, were now the difference between life and death. "Look for the igneous intrusions, Elena," his voice echoed in my memory. "They're the bones of the mountain. They won't let you down." Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the next handhold, the next ledge, the next agonizing pull. The world was reduced to the 3 feet of rock in front of my face. My body screamed for me to stop, to let go. My mind, however, was a fortress. I focused on a single point above me, a small, gnarled pine tree growing impossibly from a crack in the cliff face. That was my goal. I did not allow myself to think beyond it. Setbacks were brutal. Halfway up, a handhold I had trusted crumbled under my grip, sending a shower of rocks and dust down into the fissure. I swung wildly, my entire weight held by one arm, my body slamming against the rock face. The impact sent a bolt of lightning through my broken leg. I screamed, a raw animal sound of pure agony, dangling 70 feet in the air. For a full minute, I just hung there, my vision tunneling, the world fading to gray. I was going to fall. It was over. But then, from far below, came that familiar, urgent bark. Kodiak. He had been a constant presence, a furry sentinel pacing the floor of my prison. His barks were my metronome, a steady rhythm of encouragement. Hearing him now, his voice filled with alarm, jolted me back from the edge of unconsciousness. I would not die in front of him. I would not let his faith in me be in vain. With a surge of adrenaline born of pure rage, I swung my body, found a new foothold for my good leg, and clawed my way back to a stable position. I rested for an hour, my body trembling, my forehead pressed against the cold stone, until the waves of pain subsided into a manageable roar. The sun began to set, painting the sliver of sky above in hues of orange and purple. The cold intensified. I knew I couldn't survive a night clinging to the rock face. It was now or never. I ignored the screaming protests of my muscles. I pushed past the pain. I climbed with a frantic, desperate energy. Finally, my bleeding fingers closed around a thick root from the gnarled pine tree. I had made it. I hauled my broken body over the lip of the crevasse and collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, gasping for air, my body a single throbbing symphony of pain. I was out. I was free. But I was still miles from anywhere, and the real journey had just begun. Back in Denver, the preparations for my memorial were underway. It was to be their masterpiece, the final act in the play of their perfect crime. Mark and Chloe threw themselves into the planning with the fervor of producers staging a Broadway show. Nothing was too good for the tragic heroine, Elena Hayes. They chose the most exclusive funeral home in Cherry Creek, a place with hushed carpets, soaring ceilings, and an air of expensive solemnity. They met with the funeral director, a man named Mr. Hemlock, who was deeply moved by Mark's story. "We must honor her memory," Mark had said, dabbing his eyes with a silk handkerchief. "Elena was a woman of substance. The service must reflect that." He selected a casket made of solid, hand-polished cherry wood, the most expensive model they offered. "It will be a closed casket service, of course," he'd explained quietly, "given the circumstances." Mr. Hemlock had nodded in grave understanding. Chloe was in charge of the aesthetics. She spent a day with a florist, designing arrangements of white lilies and orchids that cost more than my first car. "Elena loved white flowers," she'd lied, her voice soft and wistful. She said they represented purity and the untouched beauty of nature. I hated lilies. They made me sneeze. But their greatest creative effort went into the eulogy. Mark spent hours in his home office, my home office, crafting the perfect speech. I can picture him there, standing in front of a mirror, practicing his delivery. He would try a line, then pause, adjusting the tremor in his voice, the single tear he would let slip at the perfect moment. I can almost hear the conversation between them, Chloe sitting on the edge of the desk filing her nails. "Is that part about her unquenchable spirit too much?" she might ask. "No, it's perfect," Mark would reply, not taking his eyes off his own reflection. "It frames her as a risk-taker. It explains the accident. Her passion was her undoing. It's tragic, but it's believable. It makes us look like we supported her dreams, even when they were dangerous." They were meticulously constructing a myth. A story so compelling, so emotionally resonant, that no one would ever think to question it. They were building a firewall of public sympathy around themselves. Every lily, every polished word, every fake tear was another brick in that wall. They were burying me. Not under 6 feet of earth, but under the weight of a beautiful, unassailable lie. The memorial wasn't for me. It was for them. It was their coronation, the public celebration of their successful coup. And they were certain their reign was about to begin. The ledge I collapsed onto wasn't the true summit, but a wide, windswept shelf of rock about 10 feet below the top. It was exposed and cold, but after the claustrophobic confines of the crevasse, it felt as vast as a continent. I lay on my back, the snow cold against my shredded jacket, and stared up at the sky. For the first time in 2 weeks, I could see the whole expanse of it, a deep, star-dusted violet of approaching night. It was so vast, so silent, so utterly indifferent. My ordeal, my pain, my fight for life, it was a meaningless speck in the face of such cosmic grandeur. And strangely, I found that comforting. My personal drama, which had been the entirety of my universe, suddenly seemed small. The betrayal, the greed, it was just a squalid little human story. The mountain, the stars, the ancient rock beneath me, they would endure long after Mark and Chloe and their stolen money had turned to dust. That realization didn't diminish my anger. It refined it. It chilled it. My desire for revenge was no longer a hot, blinding rage. It was now a cold, hard, geological force. A slow, patient, inexorable pressure that would eventually grind them into rubble. I propped myself up, my back against a rock outcropping that shielded me from the worst of the wind. Below me, from the lip of the crevasse, I heard a familiar whine. Kodiak. He couldn't climb the sheer face I had, but he was pacing the edge, looking for a way up or for me to come back down. "I'm here, boy," I yelled, my voice hoarse. "I'm here!" He barked furiously, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. I spent the night on that ledge, huddled in the goat hide, my small fire a guttering beacon of defiance against the overwhelming darkness. I didn't sleep. I planned. My mind, free from the immediate task of the climb, now focused on the next phase. I was alive, but I was also a ghost. To the world, I was dead. This was a unique, powerful advantage. They would be careless. They would be arrogant. They would never see me coming. I replayed every conversation, every shared glance between Mark and Chloe from the past few months. I saw the pattern now. The subtle web of lies they had been weaving for so long. Their affair must have been going on for years. The inheritance wasn't the cause. It was just the catalyst. The trigger that turned their casual treachery into murderous ambition. How had I been so blind? Love, I realized, wasn't just blind. It was a self-imposed cataract. You see what you want to see. You believe the stories you tell yourself because the truth is too painful to acknowledge. That night, on that ledge, I performed my own surgery. I cut away the fog of sentimentality, the lingering affection, the shared memories. I excised Mark and Chloe from my heart as cleanly as a surgeon removing a tumor. When the sun rose the next morning, casting long blue shadows across the snow, I was no longer the woman who had fallen into that crevasse. That Elena was dead. I was someone new, someone harder, someone who understood that the world wasn't governed by love or loyalty, but by the simple, brutal laws of survival. And I was a very, very good survivor. While I was being reborn in the ice, Mark was in a lavishly appointed boardroom in downtown Denver, giving the performance of his life. He was meeting with the executive board of TerraCorp, the multinational conglomerate that wanted to buy my land. The room was a study in corporate power, a sprawling table made from a single slab of polished granite, floor-to-ceiling windows with a panoramic view of the city, and a group of 6 men in tailored suits whose collective net worth could buy a small country. Mark was not intimidated. This was his arena. He was dressed in a dark, somber suit, a single white rose in his lapel. For Elena, he would tell them if they asked. He began not by talking about tellurium deposits or profit margins, but by telling them about me. He spun a beautiful, tragic tale of his brilliant wife, a woman who loved the earth with a fiery passion. He showed them photos of me on various expeditions, smiling, vibrant, alive, Elena's dream. Mark said, his voice thick with carefully rehearsed emotion, was to create a new model for resource extraction. One that was ethical, sustainable, and gave back to the land, not just took from it. She believed that science and industry could be partners, not adversaries. He let that sink in, watching their faces. They were businessmen, but they understood the power of a good story. Her sudden passing has left a void that can never be filled. But her work must continue. Her legacy must be honored. He then laid out his proposal. He wasn't just selling the land. He was offering them a narrative. He would sell the mining rights to TerraCorp under the condition that they become the primary benefactor of the newly established Elena Hayes Foundation for Sustainable Geology. It was a brilliant move. It allowed TerraCorp to greenwash their notoriously aggressive mining practices, giving them a PR victory that was worth more than the cost of the foundation itself. It made Mark look not like a greedy man cashing in on his wife's death, but like a devoted husband, honorably carrying out her dying wish. The final paperwork for the estate is being processed as we speak, he told them, his voice now crisp and businesslike. My lawyer assures me the death certificate will be issued shortly. I am hosting a memorial service for Elena this Friday. I propose we sign the final contracts immediately following the service. A quiet, private moment to turn a new page, to begin the work Elena would have wanted. The CEO of TerraCorp, a silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne, stood up and extended his hand. Mr. Hayes, he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. We are deeply moved by your story and your commitment to your wife's vision. We would be honored to be a part of her legacy. We have a deal. They shook hands, a multi-million-dollar agreement sealed on a foundation of lies and my freshly dug, empty grave. Mark smiled, a sad, noble smile for the benefit of the room. He had them. He had the money, he had the story, he had the perfect cover. The signing was set. Friday afternoon, the day of my memorial, the day of my return. It took me another full day to get myself and Kodiak off that mountain. After finding a less precipitous route down from my ledge, I was able to reunite with him on a wide, snowy ridge. He greeted me with a frenzy of licks and happy whines, circling me as if he couldn't believe I was real. Seeing him, whole and unharmed, was the first pure, uncomplicated joy I had felt in what felt like a lifetime. Getting him out of the crevasse was another challenge. I had to find a spot where the slope was gentle enough for him to scramble out, coaxing him along, while I half climbed, half crawled, dragging my shattered leg behind me. When we finally stood on the true summit of Widow's Peak, the world spread out before us. The view that was meant to be my last was now the scene of my rebirth. The wind was fierce, whipping snow into the air, but I stood against it, my arm resting on Kodiak's broad back, and I breathed it in. It was the smell of freedom. There was no time to savor the moment. A new storm was gathering in the west, the sky a bruised purple. We were still miles from any road, any sign of civilization, and we were dangerously exposed. The long walk was about to begin. My first act was to create a proper crutch. I found a sturdy pine branch with a Y-shaped fork at one end, and using my bone tool, I hacked it to the right length. It was awkward and clumsy, but it allowed me to keep my broken leg off the ground. My progress was painfully slow. Every step was a jolt of agony. The landscape, once a source of scientific wonder, was now a series of obstacles to be overcome. I used my geological knowledge to navigate. I followed the natural contours of the land, avoiding the steep, avalanche-prone slopes. I recognized the patterns of the riverbeds, even under the snow, and knew they would eventually lead to lower elevations. Kodiak was my scout, my compass, my motivation. He would range ahead, his powerful body bounding through the deep snow, then return to my side as if to check on me. His presence was a constant reassurance. We were a team. The wild woman and her wolf, emerging from the heart of the mountain. We walked for 2 days, sleeping in snow caves I dug out at the base of large trees, huddled together for warmth, sharing the last of the goat meat. My body was a wreck, but my mind was a diamond-hard point of focus. I didn't think about the past or the future. I thought only of the next step, and the one after that. On the 3rd day, I saw it. A thin gray plume of smoke rising against the white landscape. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people, hope. A feeling I had long since abandoned surged through me with an almost painful intensity. We were going to make it. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the screaming protests of my body. As we drew closer, I saw the structure. A small rustic cabin, half buried in snow. A thin trickle of smoke curling from its stone chimney. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was the edge of the world I had left behind. The cabin was an old, deserted ranger station, used now only by the occasional cross-country skier or lost hunter. The smoke I had seen was coming from a fire left smoldering in the hearth. Someone had been here recently, perhaps driven out by the same blizzard that had covered my tracks. The door was unlocked. Pushing it open, I was met with a wave of stale, woody air and the blessed relief of shelter. It was a single, dusty room with a stone fireplace, a rickety table, and 2 bunks with thin, moth-eaten mattresses. To me, it was a palace. Kodiak immediately collapsed on the floor by the hearth, exhausted. I added a few logs to the embers from a pile stacked against the wall, and soon a proper fire was crackling, filling the small space with warmth and a flickering orange light. For the first time in 16 days, I was warm. Truly, deeply warm. The feeling was so overwhelming I almost wept. My first priority was a proper assessment of my injuries. In the firelight, I unwrapped the crude splint. My leg was a swollen, discolored mess. The wound where the bone had broken the skin was angry and red, the infection I had feared now a certainty. But worse than the leg were my hands and face. My fingers were a waxy white color, the telltale sign of severe frostbite. Patches of my cheeks and the tip of my nose were the same. I knew, with a sinking finality, that I would not leave this ordeal unscarred. The mountain had marked me, inside and out. Searching the cabin, I found a treasure trove. A half-empty box of matches, a rusty can opener, and in a dusty cupboard, 3 cans of beans, a jar of instant coffee, and a small, well-stocked first aid kit. It contained antiseptic wipes, sterile bandages, and a bottle of ibuprofen. It was a miracle. I cleaned my leg as best I could, the antiseptic stinging like fire, and created a new, cleaner dressing. I swallowed 4 ibuprofen, and as the medicine began to dull the sharp edges of my pain, I felt a semblance of my old self returning. Then I saw it, lying on the table, left behind by the cabin's last visitor. A copy of the Denver Post, dated 3 days ago. My hands trembled as I picked it up, and there on the front page was a picture of me. It was a photo from a university function 2 years ago, me smiling, holding a piece of amethyst. The headline read, "Tragedy in the San Juans. Renowned geologist Elena Hayes presumed dead in hiking accident." I sank onto one of the bunks, the newspaper shaking in my grasp. I read the article, my own obituary. It was all there. The tragic accident, the devastated husband, the quotes from Mark filled with poetic grief. He talked about my adventurous spirit, my disregard for personal risk when it came to science. He was painting me as reckless, as the author of my own demise. He was not just killing me, he was rewriting the very story of my life. And then I saw the detail that made my blood run cold. A small subheading. Memorial service to be held this Friday at the Evergreen Memorial Chapel. I looked at the date on the newspaper. Then I did the math. Friday. That was tomorrow. Tomorrow they would stand up in front of all our friends and family and eulogize me. Tomorrow they would sign the papers and sell my legacy. A cold, feral smile spread across my face. They had given me a deadline, and I had every intention of making it. The fire, the food, and the ibuprofen worked a temporary magic. After a few hours of the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks, I awoke with a singular, unshakable purpose. I had to get to a road. I had to get to a phone. I had to get to Denver. I ate 2 cans of the cold beans, sharing them with Kodiak, the metallic taste of feast for my starved palate. I packed the last can, the matches, and the first aid kit into a small, tattered rucksack I found in the cabin. Using the can opener, I had punctured holes into the final bean can, and using sinew from my rope, fashioned a crude muzzle for Kodiak. I loved him, but I knew what we would look like to the first person we met. A half-dead woman and a wild, wolf-like animal. I couldn't risk him being seen as a threat. He endured the indignity with his usual quiet stoicism. Leaving the warmth of the cabin was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. The world outside was a blinding expanse of white. But my internal compass, honed by years in the field, was strong. I knew the ranger station would be situated near a service road. I just had to find it. We walked for what felt like an eternity, a slow, agonizing procession. Me, the battered ghost, leaning heavily on my crutch. Him, the loyal shadow, padding silently at my side. Finally, after hours of pushing through snowdrifts and dense forest, I saw it. A line of black asphalt, almost completely buried in snow, but unmistakably a road. A small 2-lane county road, but it was a lifeline to the world. I half stumbled, half fell onto the road's edge, my body finally giving out. I had made it this far. I could go no further. I sat in the snow, my back against a frozen bank, and I waited. Kodiak lay down beside me, resting his head on my good knee. We waited for hours. The sky began to fade into the gray of late afternoon. I was starting to lose hope, the cold seeping back into my bones, my brief surge of strength gone. Just as I was about to succumb to a sleep I knew I might not wake from, I heard it. The low rumble of an engine. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom. It was a logging truck, its massive tires churning through the snow. I waved my arms, a frantic, desperate gesture. The truck slowed, its air brakes hissing, and pulled to a stop beside me. The passenger side door opened. A large man with a thick beard and a weary face leaned out. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I must have been a horrifying sight. Emaciated, face blackened by frostbite and dirt, clothes in rags, a homemade splint on my leg. "Please," I rasped, my voice a dry whisper. "I need help. My name is Elena Hayes." The trucker's jaw dropped. He recognized the name. The whole state recognized the name. He looked from me to Kodiak, then back to me, as if he was seeing a ghost. And in a way, he was. "Elena Hayes?" he stammered. "But you're dead." I looked up at him, the first human being I had spoken to in 17 days, and I gave him a smile that was all sharp edges and broken pieces. "Not yet," I said. The trucker's name was Gus. He wrapped me in a thick, greasy blanket from his cab and gave me a thermos of lukewarm coffee that tasted like heaven. He was a kind man, his initial shock quickly replaced by a gruff, protective concern. He made a call on his CB radio, his voice crackling with an urgency that underscored the sheer impossibility of the situation. "This is Big Gus on County Road 212. You're not gonna believe this. I think I found her. That geologist lady, Elena Hayes. Yeah, the one who died. Well, she's sitting right here next to me. The response was a burst of static and disbelief, but Gus was insistent. An hour later, we rendezvoused with a sheriff's cruiser at a desolate intersection. The sheriff, a young deputy named Miller, approached the truck cautiously, his hand near his sidearm. When he saw me, he froze, his face paling under the flashing red and blue lights of his car. He had seen my picture on the news every night for a week. The next few hours were a whirlwind of institutional procedure that felt utterly surreal after the stark simplicity of my fight for survival. I was taken to a small rural hospital, a place that smelled of antiseptic and quiet suffering. They cut away my ruined clothes, clucking with sympathy and shock at the state of my body. They x-rayed my leg, confirming the severe compound fracture. They treated my frostbite, the doctors speaking in hushed tones about the likelihood of permanent scarring. I refused all sedation. I needed my mind clear. As they worked on me, I told my story to Deputy Miller. I told him everything, leaving out no detail. The inheritance, the overheard conversation, the hike, the push, the fall. Mark and Chloe's faces as they watched me disappear. Miller listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to horror to a grim, steely resolve. He had a tape recorder, and my voice, hoarse and weak but unwavering, filled the small examination room. The hospital staff wanted to admit me, to put me under observation, to operate on my leg immediately. I refused. "What time is it?" I asked the nurse. "It's almost 10 o'clock in the morning, honey," she said gently. Friday morning. The memorial was scheduled for 1 o'clock that afternoon. I had 3 hours. "Deputy," I said, my voice gaining a strength I didn't know I had. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to get me to Denver. Now. And I need you to make some calls. I want a full police presence, plain clothes, at the Evergreen Memorial Chapel at 1 p.m. And I want them to wait for my signal." Miller looked at me, then at my broken body, then back at my eyes. He saw the iron will there, the unyielding purpose. This wasn't a victim asking for help. This was a commander giving an order. He nodded slowly. "And your husband? Your sister? Do they know you're alive?" he asked. A cold smile touched my lips. "No," I said. "And they won't. Not until I walk through that chapel door and introduce myself. It's a surprise party, and I'd hate for them to miss it." The resurrection was complete. The retribution was about to begin. The ride to Denver was a 4-hour journey through a phantom world. Strapped into the back of Deputy Miller's cruiser, with Kodiak's head resting faithfully on my lap, I watched the snowy landscape of the high country give way to the brown, rolling foothills, and finally the sprawling suburbs of the Front Range. Every mile marker was a tick of a clock, counting down to the most important moment of my life. My body was a battleground. The hospital had given me a powerful shot of Toradol for the pain, which had dulled the agony in my leg to a deep, manageable throb. But my nerves were frayed and screaming. Every bump in the road was a jolt of fire. Deputy Miller drove with a quiet, focused intensity, speaking periodically into his radio in a low, coded language. He was coordinating the plainclothes officers, ensuring everything would be in place. He had arranged for a local officer to meet us at a discreet location on the outskirts of the city. We pulled into a deserted parking lot behind a strip mall. A female officer, her name tag reading Sergeant Ortega, was waiting with 2 large duffel bags. She didn't stare. Her eyes, professional and compassionate, took in my hospital gown and my ravaged face with a brief clinical assessment. "We brought some things for you, Ms. Hayes," she said, her voice calm and steady. "We weren't sure of your size, so there are a few options." Inside the bags were simple, clean clothes. Soft black trousers with a stretchy waistband, a warm turtleneck sweater, a thick dark gray wool coat, and a pair of sturdy, flat-soled winter boots for my good foot. There was also a brush and other basic toiletries. Dressing in the cramped back seat of the cruiser was an exercise in painful contortion. But with each layer of normal clothing, I felt like I was putting on a suit of armor. I was shedding the identity of the victim, the half-frozen creature from the crevasse, and becoming someone else, someone ready for war. Sergeant Ortega also handed me a cheap, prepaid cell phone. Deputy Miller told me you might need this. It's untraceable. I nodded my thanks, my mind already working. I made one call. It was to Mr. Abernathy, my grandfather's lawyer. His secretary answered. I need to speak to him. It's a matter of extreme urgency regarding the Thomas Hayes estate. I'm sorry, who is calling? She asked, her voice polite but firm. Tell him it's a ghost, I said, and hung up. He would understand. As we drove the final few miles into the city, I saw the skyline of Denver. The familiar buildings where I had attended meetings, had dinner with friends, lived my life. It felt like looking at a photograph of a foreign country. The world had gone on without me. People were rushing to lunch, complaining about traffic, living their ordinary, beautiful lives, completely unaware of the dark, violent drama that had unfolded just a few hours away in the mountains. They were all characters in a play, and they didn't know the main character, who was supposed to be dead, was in the audience, about to walk onto the stage and burn the whole theater down. We pulled up a block away from the Evergreen Memorial Chapel. It was 12:45 p.m. We were 15 minutes early. Perfect timing. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and sorrow. The room was packed, a testament to the life I had built and the lie Mark had sold. Friends from the university, former colleagues, neighbors, and distant family members filled the polished pews. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones, dabbing at their eyes with tissues, their faces etched with a genuine grief that made the deception all the more obscene. Mark and Chloe stood near the entrance, receiving the mourners. They were the stars of this morbid production. Mark looked haggardly handsome in a perfectly tailored black suit, his face a mask of noble suffering. He would hold someone's hand, look them in the eye, and whisper, "Thank you so much for coming. It means the world to us." Chloe, a vision in a simple but devastatingly expensive black dress, stood slightly behind him, her hand resting on his arm. She played the part of the supportive, grief-stricken sister, offering a watery smile here, a comforting touch there. They were a portrait of shared tragedy, their secret affair now legitimized by their shared public mourning. I can picture the scene so clearly. My best friend from grad school, Sarah, her face puffy from crying, would hug Mark. "I can't believe she's gone, Mark. She was so careful, so experienced." And Mark would reply, his voice catching, "I know, but the mountain, it doesn't care how experienced you are. It takes who it wants." He was a master, turning my greatest strengths, my competence, my knowledge, into the very reason for my death. At a small, discreet table near the front of the chapel, another scene was being set. A man in an impeccable suit sat quietly, a thick leather briefcase on his lap. It was Marcus Thorne, the CEO of TerraCorp, along with his chief legal counsel. They were there to pay their respects, of course, but also to be present for the signing. A tasteful, beautifully bound copy of the contract was inside that briefcase. They were watching Mark, impressed by his grace under pressure, confident they had backed the right man. As the pews filled, Mark and Chloe took their seats in the front row. The organist played a somber prelude. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was captive. Mark felt a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was done. He had navigated every obstacle. In a few minutes, he would deliver a eulogy that would cement his reputation as a tragic, heroic figure. Then, a quiet signing, a transfer of funds, and a new life would begin. He squeezed Chloe's hand under the cover of the program. She squeezed back. They exchanged a look, A quick, secret flash of victory. They were safe. The ghost was buried. The money was theirs. And no one would ever know the truth. The world was theirs for the taking. At 12:55 p.m., I stood on the sidewalk across the street from the chapel, hidden in the shadow of a large oak tree. The street was lined with expensive cars, the physical manifestation of the comfortable lives my friends and family lived. Lives I had once been a part of. From this distance, they were just figures in dark suits and dresses, moving like ants into the pristine white chapel. My chapel. My memorial. Deputy Miller stood beside me, his demeanor calm, but his eyes constantly scanning. Sergeant Ortega was with Kodiak, keeping him quiet and out of sight in the back of an unmarked van. He was muzzled and on a tight leash, but I could feel his coiled energy even from a distance. He knew something was about to happen. My leg was a pillar of fire. The Toradol was wearing off, and the reality of my injuries was crashing back in on me. I leaned heavily on the simple wooden crutch Ortega had provided. Every breath of the cold city air was a struggle. I was running on nothing but adrenaline and a reservoir of hate so deep it felt bottomless. "Are you sure about this, Ms. Hayes?" Miller asked, his voice low. "We can go in now. We can arrest them quietly." I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the chapel doors. No, quietly is not how this ends. They created a public spectacle out of my death. I'm going to create one out of my resurrection. They need to be exposed, humiliated, in front of every single person they lied to. He didn't argue. He understood that this was about more than just a legal resolution. This was about justice in its most primal, theatrical form. I looked down at my hands. The frostbite had turned the tips of my fingers a bruised, purplish black. My face, which I had only briefly glimpsed in the cruiser's rearview mirror, was a stranger's. A gaunt, hollow-eyed mask with angry red welts of frostbite on the cheeks and nose. My hair was matted, my body emaciated. I was a creature forged in ice and pain. I was unrecognizable. And that was my greatest weapon. At precisely 1 o'clock, the chapel doors closed. The show was beginning. "It's time," I said. Ortega opened the van door. Kodiak sprang out, every muscle in his body taut. He looked up at me, his blue eyes asking the question. I removed his muzzle. "Okay, boy," I whispered, my hand on his head. "Let's go see Daddy." I took a deep, shuddering breath and started my slow, painful hobble across the street. Miller and 2 other plainclothes officers fell into step behind me, a silent, grim honor guard. The ghost and her hellhound were coming home. Inside, the chapel was silent, except for the sound of Mark's voice. He stood at the ornate wooden pulpit, a single spotlight illuminating him, casting the rest of the room in a respectful gloom. He was at the climax of his eulogy, and he was magnificent. His voice, rich and resonant, filled the space, a symphony of controlled grief. He held a piece of paper, but he barely looked at it. He had rehearsed this. He knew his lines by heart. "Eleno was a force of nature," he said, his gaze sweeping across the tear-streaked faces in the pews. "Like the geological forces she so loved to study, she was powerful, she was beautiful, and at times, she was untamable." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He could see them, all of them, hanging on his every word. Sarah was sobbing openly. Even my stern Uncle Robert had a tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "Many of you have asked me if I ever worried, if I ever wished she would choose a safer path. The truth is," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I did. Every day. But to ask Elena not to explore, not to climb, not to seek the next discovery, that would have been like asking the sun not to rise. It was who she was. Her spirit was too vast to be contained in an office, in a city, in a normal life. He was brilliant. He was framing my murder as the inevitable consequence of my own character. He wasn't the villain. He was the helpless, loving husband who had been forced to stand by and watch his magnificent, reckless wife dance too close to the edge. He looked over at Chloe in the front row. She met his gaze, her eyes glistening with perfectly timed, unshed tears. It was their secret signal, the final act. He took a shaky breath, summoning the crescendo of his performance. In my last conversation with her, she spoke of the land she had inherited. Not of its monetary value, but of its spirit. She wanted to build something that would last, a legacy. And so, in her memory, with the help of our friends at TerraCorp, he gestured vaguely toward Marcus Thorne, who gave a solemn nod. We will fulfill that dream. Every dollar from her estate will be used to ensure her work continues. Her name will live on. He looked up, as if toward heaven. So I say not goodbye, my love, but until we meet again. On whatever peak, in whatever wild place you have now gone to explore. His voice broke. He put a hand to his face, his shoulders shaking. The perfect final touch. The room was utterly silent, save for the sound of stifled sobs. He had done it. He had won. The story was written. The myth was set in stone. He was the hero. He was the victim. He was untouchable. And in that perfect, triumphant silence, a single, savage bark echoed from the back of the chapel. The bark was an alien sound in the sanctified quiet of the chapel. It wasn't the playful yip of a small dog. It was a deep, chest-rattling sound of aggression and warning. Every head in the room snapped toward the back. Conversations stopped. Sobs hitched in people's throats. Mark froze at the pulpit, his performance shattered, a look of pure confusion on his face. Then, the heavy oak doors of the chapel swung inward with a deafening creak, pushed open by an unseen hand. They revealed a figure standing silhouetted against the bright, cold light of the street. It was a terrifying spectral image. A gaunt, skeletal figure, leaning on a crude wooden crutch, cloaked in a dark, shapeless coat. And beside the figure, standing proud and menacing, was a massive Siberian husky. Its lips curled back from its teeth in a low, rumbling growl, its piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd. A collective gasp swept through the room. People recoiled in their seats. Who was this creature? This vagrant who had dared to interrupt such a solemn occasion? For a moment, no one recognized me. I was too broken, too changed. I was an apparition, a thing from a nightmare. I took one slow, deliberate step into the chapel, my crutch making a dull thump on the stone floor. Then another. Thump. Kodiak moved with me, a silent, menacing shadow. As I moved out of the silhouette and into the dim light of the chapel, a murmur spread through the crowd. A friend from the university squinted, her hand flying to her mouth. My Uncle Robert's eyes went wide. They were seeing past the scars, past the emaciation. They were seeing my eyes, the only part of me that was unchanged. I lifted my head and looked directly down the long aisle to the front of the room. I saw Chloe first. Her face, which had been a perfect mask of grief, had gone slack with sheer, uncomprehending terror. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving a pasty, sickly white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then I looked at Mark. He was still standing at the pulpit, his carefully crafted eulogy clutched in his hand. He stared at me, his jaw unhinged. The blood had vanished from his face so completely, he looked like a marble statue. It wasn't the look of a man seeing a loved one returned. It was the look of a man seeing his own damnation. A ghost who had clawed its way out of the grave to drag him down to hell. The silence in the room was absolute, a crushing, heavy weight. It was the silence of 100 people witnessing the impossible. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. My presence was a scream. I started the long walk down the aisle. Thump. The sound of my crutch. Click, click. The sound of Kodiak's claws on the stone. Thump, click, click. It was the only sound in the world. The sound of a reckoning. The walk down that aisle felt like 100 miles. Every eye was on me. I could feel the heat of their stares, the weight of their disbelief. They were a sea of frozen faces, a tableau of shock. I ignored them all. My focus was narrowed to a single point. The two people in the front row, my husband and my sister, who were now trapped between the pews with nowhere to run. With every step, the pain in my leg was a fresh torment, but I welcomed it. It was a reminder. It was the fuel. I walked with my head held high, my gaze locked with Mark's. I watched the terror in his eyes curdle into a desperate, frantic search for an explanation, for an escape. He looked from me to Chloe and back again, his mind, which had been so sharp, so cunning, now completely shattered. I finally reached the front of the chapel. I stopped directly in front of the small table where Marcus Thorne, the CEO of TerraCorp, sat with his lawyer. On the polished wood between them lay the contract, a thick, pristine document tied with a silk ribbon. A document that was to sign away my life's legacy. Thorne was staring at me, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. He was a smart man. He was beginning to understand that the flawless deal he had just agreed to was about to become a very, very public nightmare. I didn't acknowledge him. I didn't look at Chloe, who was shaking uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands. I looked only at Mark, who was still frozen behind the pulpit. I leaned my crutch against the front pew. Then, with my one good hand, I reached down, picked up the contract, and with a slow, deliberate motion, I ripped it in half. The sound of tearing paper was like a gunshot in the silent room. I ripped it again, and again, and again, until the pieces fluttered from my frost-bitten fingers like dead leaves onto the floor. A wave of gasps and whispers erupted from the crowd. The spell was broken. This was real. I turned my head slowly and looked at Mark. My voice, when I finally used it, was not a shout. It was a low, raspy, and dangerously calm whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "Hello, Mark," I said. "Did you miss me?" He flinched as if I had struck him. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged. "Elena, how? You're dead." "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," I said, the words dripping with ice. "You, of all people, should know that. You were there when it happened. You had a front row seat." The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, more frantic. They were starting to understand. This wasn't a miraculous return. This was an accusation. Marcus Thorne from TerraCorp was the first to react. He was a man who didn't get to his position without having a keen instinct for disaster. He stood up, his face a stony mask. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice low and furious, directed at Mark. But I answered for him. "The meaning, Mr. Thorne," I said, turning my gaze to him, "is that you've been negotiating a deal with a man who tried to murder the owner of the property you wish to buy." Thorne's eyes widened. His lawyer was already discreetly packing his briefcase. They were in full damage control mode. Mark finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate sound. "She's delirious. Look at her. The fall, it must have affected her mind. She's confused." He was trying to reclaim the narrative, to paint me as a madwoman, a victim of trauma. It was a good strategy. It might have even worked. But he had forgotten about the one variable he never took seriously. "Am I confused, Mark?" I asked softly. "Was I confused when you pushed me from the ledge on Widow's Peak? Or were you the one who was confused, thinking the cold would be enough to finish the job?" I then reached down and unclipped the small, waterproof pouch from Kodiak's collar. It was mud-stained and worn, but intact. I held it up for the room to see. "You're a man who loves technology, Mark. Gadgets, the latest thing." My voice was cold, clinical, the voice of a scientist presenting her findings. "You bought this for Kodiak last year, a top-of-the-line GPS collar. It tracks his location, his speed, his heart rate, all synced to a cloud server. You thought the battery had died weeks ago because you never bothered to charge it. But I did. The morning we left for the hike." A dawning, sickening horror washed over Mark's face. He knew what was coming. "This device," I continued, my voice growing stronger, louder, "recorded our entire trip. It recorded our ascent up the mountain. It recorded the exact moment we stopped at the ledge. It recorded Kodiak's heart rate skyrocketing in distress as he watched you shove me into that crevasse. And most importantly," I let the words hang in the air, a final, fatal blow. "It recorded your position, standing at the edge of that cliff for a full 10 minutes after I fell, and then walking away, with no call for help, no attempt at rescue. It's all there, Mark. Every second of your betrayal, time-stamped and uploaded. A perfect digital witness to your crime." Marcus Thorne didn't need to hear another word. "This deal is off," he said, his voice like cracking ice. "TerraCorp is withdrawing its offer immediately. We will, of course, be cooperating fully with the authorities." He and his lawyer turned and walked swiftly down the aisle, pushing past the stunned mourners, fleeing the scene of the crime before they became accessories to it. The first domino had fallen. The moment Thorne and his lawyer walked out, the chapel erupted into chaos. The carefully constructed facade of grief and solemnity shattered into a million pieces. People were on their feet, shouting questions, pointing, their faces a mixture of horror, confusion, and dawning, furious understanding. Mark was trapped. The exit was blocked by the CEO he had just tried to swindle, and the pulpit was no longer a stage, but a cage. His eyes darted around the room, wild and desperate, like a cornered animal. He looked at Chloe, a silent, pleading cry for help. But Chloe had completely shut down. She was curled into a tight ball in the front pew, rocking back and forth, her hands over her ears as if she could block out the nightmare that had just become her reality. There was no help there. That was my signal. I caught Deputy Miller's eye at the back of the chapel, and I gave a single, sharp nod. The heavy oak doors burst open again, but this time it wasn't a ghost who entered. It was 4 uniformed police officers, their presence immediately silencing the cacophony in the room. They moved down the aisle with a heavy, purposeful tread, parting the crowd like a ship through water. They flanked Mark at the pulpit. Miller stepped forward, his voice calm, professional, and utterly damning in the now silent room. "Mark Hayes, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Elena Hayes and for felony fraud." He gestured to the other side of the pew. "Chloe Martin, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut around Mark's wrists was a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to echo off every surface. His arrogance, his confidence, it all evaporated in that single, final sound. He was suddenly just a small, pathetic man in an expensive suit. "You can't do this!" he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy. "There's been a mistake. She's lying." But no one was listening. No one believed him anymore. They pulled Chloe from the pew. She didn't resist. She was limp, her face a blank, tear-streaked mask. As they led her past me, her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. There was nothing in them. No remorse, no anger, just a vast, empty void. The sister I had loved was truly gone, if she had ever existed at all. They were paraded down the same aisle they had so confidently walked down an hour earlier. But this time, they were not the grieving heroes. They were monsters, exposed in the harsh light of truth. The friends and family who had offered them sympathy now stared at them with expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. My Uncle Robert, a man of few words, simply spat on the floor as Mark passed by. The walk of shame was complete. As the doors of the chapel closed behind them, I finally allowed my body to give way. I leaned heavily against the pulpit, my legs trembling, the strength that had carried me this far finally gone. Sarah, my friend, rushed to my side, her arms wrapping around me. And in the safety of her embrace, surrounded by the wreckage of my old life, I finally allowed myself to cry. The aftermath was a media firestorm. The story of the ghost of the San Juans was on every news channel, every newspaper front page for weeks. The tale was too cinematic to resist. The murderous husband, the treacherous sister, the loyal dog, and the woman who had literally climbed out of her own grave to seek justice. My privacy was gone, but it was a price I was willing to pay. Their public humiliation was as much a part of the punishment as any prison sentence. The trial was a formality. The data from Kodiak's GPS collar was irrefutable. It was the star witness, a silent digital narrator of their crime. Combined with my testimony and the overheard conversation I had relayed to the police, their fate was sealed. The jury was out for less than an hour. Mark was found guilty of attempted murder and a slew of fraud charges. He was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 30 years. Chloe, for her role as a conspirator, received a sentence of 20 years. I saw them one last time in the courtroom as they were led away in chains. They looked diminished, hollowed out, their once bright futures reduced to a concrete cell. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, just a vast, quiet emptiness. They were no longer a part of my story. The months that followed were a slow, painful process of healing, both physically and emotionally. I had multiple surgeries on my leg, a long and arduous process of pins and plates and physical therapy. The frostbite left its mark, a permanent latticework of fine, silvery scars on my cheeks and hands. They are my daily reminder, not of what I lost, but of what I survived. I sold the house in Denver, the one filled with too many ghosts. I legally reclaimed my full inheritance, the land that Mark and Chloe had been willing to kill for. And I knew, with absolute certainty, what I had to do with it. I wasn't going to sell it. I wasn't going to mine it. I was going to honor it. I used a portion of the funds to establish the Hayes Wilderness Sanctuary and Animal Rescue. The 1,000-acre property, with its rich tellurium deposits still sleeping soundly in the earth, became a protected haven. I built a state-of-the-art animal shelter and rehabilitation center on the site of the old ranger station where I had found my salvation. It became a place where abandoned and abused animals, especially northern breeds like Huskies, could find safety and a second chance. My life found a new rhythm, a new purpose. It was a quiet life, governed by the changing seasons and the needs of the animals in my care. My days were filled with the simple, honest work of healing. I walked the trails of my land, my leg now strong, my crutch long since discarded. Kodiak was always by my side, his blue eyes bright, his tail held high. He was the undisputed king of this wild domain, a living legend among the staff and volunteers. We had come full circle. The wilderness that was meant to be our tomb had become our sanctuary. My office window looks out onto a sprawling meadow. In the distance, the snow-capped peaks of the San Juans, including the sharp, unforgiving silhouette of Widow's Peak, stand against a brilliant blue sky. I no longer see them as a place of trauma. I see them as a crucible. A place that burned away everything I thought I was and forged me into the person I am today. It's late afternoon, and a group of newly rescued huskies are playing in the deep snow of the enclosed pasture, their joyful barks echoing in the crisp mountain air. Kodiak lies at my feet, his head on his paws, now a noble, graying old man. But his eyes still hold the same fierce loyalty that pulled me back from the abyss. This is my life now. It's not the life I planned, but it's a life I chose. A life I earned. The scars on my face have faded, but they are still there, a map of my journey. Sometimes a visitor at the sanctuary will ask about them, and I simply smile and say, "The West remembers." It remembers the cold, the pain, the betrayal, but it also remembers the resilience, the loyalty, and the fierce, unyielding power of the will to live. Mark and Chloe will likely spend the rest of their lives in prison, their names now just a footnote in a sensational crime story. They have become ghosts of a different kind, haunting the lonely corridors of their own bad choices. Their punishment isn't just the loss of freedom. It's the knowledge that their greed ultimately bought them nothing but a cold, empty cell, while I was left with everything that truly matters. When I look back on this story, it's easy to see it as a simple tale of good versus evil, of survival against the odds. But the truth is more complicated. The greatest mistake I made wasn't trusting my husband. It was not trusting myself. For years, my instincts had been whispering to me. I saw the small signs of Mark's dissatisfaction, the subtle shifts in his character, the way Chloe's affection sometimes felt more like envy. But I ignored that quiet voice. I chose comfort over truth because I was afraid of what the truth would mean for the life I had so carefully constructed. The real villain in the early part of my story wasn't just Mark's greed. It was my own denial. Mark and Chloe's error was more fundamental. They suffered from a profound poverty of the soul. They believed that value was something you could own, something you could extract from the earth and trade for a yacht. They never understood that true value lies in things that cannot be bought: loyalty, integrity, and love. In their lust for my inheritance, they failed to see the true treasure they already possessed and were throwing away: family. They were so focused on the tellurium in the ground that they couldn't see the gold right in front of them. That blindness was their undoing. This story is a brutal lesson in consequences. The consequence of ignoring your intuition is that you leave yourself vulnerable to those who would harm you. The consequence of betrayal is that you create an enemy with nothing left to lose, and that is the most dangerous enemy of all. If I could go back, I wouldn't warn myself about Mark. I would warn myself about me. I would tell that younger Elena to listen to the knot in her stomach, to honor her own perceptions, and to understand that setting a boundary or asking a hard question is not an act of distrust, but an act of self-preservation. You cannot prevent the wicked from being wicked, but you can refuse to be their willing, oblivious victim. So I ask you, as you reflect on my story, have you ever ignored that quiet voice inside you? Have you ever chosen the comfortable lie over the difficult truth in your own life, big or small? Your answer might reveal more than you think. Thank you for listening to my story. Please consider subscribing for more tales of survival and resilience.